Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Health Babes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Campbell with Dr. Crystal Hone. Today, we had Britt Frank on. She's an amazing clinician. She is an educator and a trauma specialist. We talked a lot about how trauma can affect your health. We talk about the misconceptions of self-sabotage and being lazy and just the way that we talk to ourselves. So I think you're really going to love this episode. Let's welcome Britt. So welcome, Britt. We are so excited to have you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk to you both.
Yes, we have been looking forward to this. We had to reschedule a few times, probably my fault. But we really wanted you on here. So we're so excited. So, we know how much trauma plays a role in people's health. And, this is the Health Babes podcast. And so it's really, really important to address this kind of stuff. And we actually have patients where sometimes we won't work with them unless they work on this kind of stuff first, because we're like, what supplement are we going to give you?
Yeah.
So this is so important to us and so important for our audience to really understand how important the work that you do is. So why don't we kind of start by talking about your story a little bit?
Oh no, the sordid story. So, and I love that you two are about trauma, because people come to me every day with supplements and the medications and their diet list and their exercise plan. And I'm like, that's great, but your nervous system is so out of whack. So,
which means it won't tolerate any of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I deflected your question there. I'll go back to that. My story.
I love you.
So I came from what looked like a normal family, but was just this incredibly chaotic, complex maze of things I didn't even know qualified as trauma, because I didn't even hear the word trauma until I was in my mid-20s. And my therapist was like, guess what? You have some trauma. It's like, no, I don't. What are you talking about? I'm fine. Everyone does this stuff. And then, my ways to cope with my childhood trauma escalated into drug addiction, sex and love addiction, and relationship craziness, and domestically violent relationships, and a religious cult. Because I pinged from meth's not working. Maybe I can do like cult life and just pray all day, and maybe that will work. And none of that stuff really works. It all works temporarily, or we wouldn't do it. But eventually I found my way to trauma therapy and the 12-step program. And it was like, oh, I am such a hot mess. Cool. But at least I have a name for it now. Yeah. And I say that with no shame. People are like, how could you call yourself a hot mess? I'm like, empirically, that is fact. This is not a judgment. It is a circumstance. It is fact. And that's okay. And I understand where it came from and why it happened. I don't co-sign on my crap, but I get it. And once you understand a little bit about how the brain works, you can change things. And there's no such thing as crazy. I was convinced that I was certifiably crazy. I have now since learned as a clinician, there is no such thing as a crazy person.
Wow. I love that.
Interesting, because I have met many people who I thought that person's crazy.
Not everyone's behavior is acceptable.
Right.
But everyone's behavior if the definition of crazy is they're just like seeing things and hearing things and believing things and saying things that make no sense, that's just not accurate. Everyone's stuff makes sense up close. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's stuff should just be tolerated, especially behaviors that harm other people. But there's no such thing as crazy. Just because we don't know why something is happening doesn't mean that there's not a really good reason for it to be happening.
I think it's more like the behaviors and more like things, when people, and especially in relationships, do things and you're like, they have to be crazy in order to treat another person like that. Like, I think that's more along the lines of where I've thought that way.
I have too. And I've also thought, what kind of crazy am I to have tolerated that behavior for as long as And people who don't understand these crazy making relationships don't understand that it seems normal. What is totally crazy from the outside. Now, people who engage in really toxic, abusive behavior, they're not crazy. Unfortunately, they're quite aware of a lot, often, not always, not everyone, but often toxic, abusive people are very well aware of what they're doing. It's bad, but it's not crazy. It's horrible, but it's not crazy. It's intolerable, but it's not crazy.
Wow. I never
That's a
thought of
really
it
good
that way.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you work a lot with trauma, and I was listening to a couple of other podcasts that you were on, and I love how you talked about how it was a lot of brain indigestion. So can you elaborate on that?
Thank you for saying that. The word trauma, we went from no one talks about trauma to now everyone is using the word trauma, which is great, but it sort of has lost what it means. And people think that there are people who have trauma and people who don't. And the reason my work is the science of stuck and not the science of trauma is because trauma is like indigestion. We don't all have the same trauma. We don't all have the same level of whatever it is we're dealing with. But indigestion is a fact of life, and so is trauma. It just means your brain didn't metabolize an experience. Like, it's not good, but we need to normalize. It doesn't mean you're broken or sick or bad. It's an injury, just like any injury, and it can heal with access and resources and safety.
Yeah. So why do we get stuck?
I love the word so much because not everyone relates to trauma, but everyone knows we all, I don't care how functional and shiny someone's Instagram grid looks, we all get stuck somewhere. And I know that because my office is full of people all day. I think a big reason we get stuck is because we believe that we're crazy.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm just crazy, then there's nothing to be done. If it's just, this is the way I am, end of discussion. And so if we're not given accurate information, then there's nothing that we can do. And so I stayed stuck often because I believed I was just I had an addictive personality and I was crazy. And this was just my lot to just contend with. And again, no shame. Mental illness is real and I take meds and there's no shame in it. But often what we call mental illness is our brain doing what brains are designed to do, which is keep us alive. And so with the wrong information, there's nowhere for us to go but stuck. So that's a biggie why we stay stuck.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
you talk about thinking yourself forward. What does that mean?
I mean, have you ever tried to think your way out of something? It doesn't usually, like, I know logically this shouldn't bother me. I know logically I should probably make myself do X, Y, and Z, but nevertheless, I am not. And that's true in both directions.
Yeah.
Where we don't do the things that we know we're, quote, supposed to do to make us happy. And we are doing the things that we know we're not supposed to do. So where's the discrepancy there? And so it's so important to know there's reasons and everything makes sense up close. We all get stuck and there is a way forward out of stuck.
Yeah. How do you feel about how, health and wellness, like mental health is treated like in the conventional model? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, present company aside, I love that this is a conversation. This conversation doesn't usually happen between the different worlds. You know, the mental health world is over there. The medical world is over there. Never the two shall meet.
Yeah.
And it's so important to know that mental health shouldn't even be called mental health because it's physiological. It's in our nervous system. It's in our bodies. There's this huge divide between what we call mental health and what we call physical health, but health is health.
Right. Right. And they do coincide, the different worlds, for sure. Like we were just talking about earlier. What about anxiety? You know, we hear people say, I have anxiety, I'm anxious, I suffer from anxiety, whatever, panic attacks, all these things. So you say anxiety is necessary? Why do you say that?
So, well, going back to your, why do we need anxiety? Because how are we going to know if we're out of alignment with either something that's not safe or something that's not authentically us?
Right.
It's sort of like the check engine light on your car. It's not pleasant. I don't enjoy it when my smoke alarm goes off. I don't like feeling debilitating anxiety. I hate it. And anxiety doesn't come out of nowhere. And I hear every day, well, I was fine. Everything was fine. And suddenly I was anxious out of nowhere. And again, if you look up close, it never comes out of nowhere. I was watching a stand-up comic. I can't remember who it was, but she was so funny. And she's like, I was depressed for no reason until I sat down and realized there were lots of reasons. And our stuff makes sense in context. We need to be willing to look at the hard context, but anxiety is really important. Otherwise, we're just going to coast and have no idea which way is north.
Yeah.
So what about like when you get anxiety about a situation and then you remember that, and then you bring that anxiety into other situations that really aren't dangerous?
Mhm.
You know, how you kind of get like a panic attack about getting a panic attack. I suffered like my whole college years. I got one panic attack, and then I got panic attacks about getting another panic attack in front of people, right? So I suffered for years with that. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And how do we break that?
It's really hard. And that goes back to, you can't think your way out of stuck. Often, logically, don't panic about panic, because panicking about panic is going to create more of the thing. But logic doesn't work when our brain is stuck in fight and flight.
Wow.
And so I can validate to someone who's panicking about having a panic attack. Well, it makes sense that you'd feel that way. Logically, it's not true, but to your body, it is true. And so instead of fighting, because I used to have that too, and I would beat the crap out of myself. Like, why are you being so stupid? If you go down this road, this is what's going to happen. But we have to start with, to my amygdala, this panic about panic is just as real as if there were a lion. And so I like to do reality testing to first, like, let's rule out that there is in fact no danger, because sometimes there is danger. And if there is no danger, then we need to work with the body instead of with our thoughts. So I have like my little Instagrammable, you can't always solve a somatic problem with a cognitive solution.
Yeah.
In other words, you can't always talk yourself out of panic. Sometimes you have to walk yourself out of panic, or plank yourself out of panic, or take an ice cold bath your way out of panic. But it doesn't always work to logic our way out of our symptoms.
Yeah. So speaking of somatic, one thing that worked for me well, and I only discovered this not that long ago, was somatic therapy. Do you agree? I mean, what are your thoughts on somatic therapy?
Well, I've done the 3-year training and the multi-thousand-hour program, and I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner. So I'm going with.
You love it.
I am such a fan. Was it helpful for you?
So helpful. Yeah. Why don't you explain kind of what it is for people that don't know?
It's a mouthful. So somatic experiencing, in like shorthand, it just means you have a body and a brain, and your brain does things. And when you learn how to drive it, you can feel more in control, instead of having your body constantly reacting to your environment and having no idea that that's what's happening.
Yeah. So what does somatic therapy look like?
So forgive me, Dr. Peter Levine, who created it, for my shorthand, but my first somatic therapy session as a client was so confusing, because the therapist asked, because I was really angry about something, and she's like, well, where in your body do you feel your anger? I'm like, in my head. What are you talking about? Like, I don't understand this question. She's like, where in your body do you feel the anger? And I was so pissed off. I did not understand. Like, this question made no sense to me, because I had spent my whole life dissociated, and I didn't even know I was in a body. So a large part of somatic therapy is helping you tolerate the sensations of being human. Like, that is actually, in fact, what a lot of what we call mental illness is, the biological markers aside, that it is completely unbearable to live with the pain of what has happened to us or what has happened around us. And we can't cope with that pain. And so our body tries to help us escape it. And that is our body doing what it's supposed to do. Doesn't mean don't take the meds and don't do the things.
Yeah.
But again, there's no such thing as crazy. And when you understand that your body does things, what once felt crazy suddenly is still unpleasant, but it makes sense.
So what I've experienced and what we see with a lot of our patients is people will have trauma that stores itself basically in their body, and it creates illness, really. And it's not that the person's not ill, like a lot of people go to the doctor and they're like, oh, this, antidepressant is the only thing you need because there's nothing on your labs, right? And we see this all the time. But so we're not saying that, but what we are seeing is that sometimes trauma that it's undealt with, it gets buried into your body and it creates symptoms, and it can make you very, very, very sick. And so when I said earlier that we have a lot of our patients deal with their trauma first, it's because some of the things that they're feeling have nothing to do with anything that we can, address. Really, it's that what the trauma has done to their body has made them sick. And the longer it's undealt with and more severe maybe it is to them, it can make them not tolerate anything, they, whatever their situation is. So from my experience with somatic therapy, it's a lot of body movement, like with your therapy, and you're kind of like getting that stored trauma inside. What you said, like, where do you feel it? I felt it like in my chest, in my gut, like, and it was about getting that up and out, and to do that. And it was crazy because I did this with a therapist, and he was kind of having me talk about something that was a trauma for me. And I was kind of crying, but not really. And then he had me start moving my hips in a circle. And I was kind of like, this is weird, and then I did, and I started bawling. And it's just this trapped like energy, right, in your body. And then I've done that, and I've gone so far as to like punching a pillow and like needing a nap because you go like bananas on an object or whatever, there's different levels to it. But I'm telling you, it's amazing. For me, it was much more effective than any kind of talk therapy.
And for me, because you can't bypass the body when you start paying attention. I could talk about my trauma and here's why my family is blah, blah, right. And here's why this, blah. But the somatic work is wild. I felt like I was having witchcraft and wizardry put on me. Because like I had one like the hip circle where I was just opening my mouth like this.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I'm shaking and sweating and dry heaving and bawling. And it's like, what the hell are you doing to me, woman? And as a practitioner, it's the same thing, but it's not magic. It is science. But if you don't know that your body does it, it's going to feel really terrifying being in a body, and then really terrifying initially healing when this weird stuff starts happening. But like, that's how you get it up and out. It's like puking isn't pleasant, but that's how you get a poison out of you.
It's true. You got to get it out.
So like people on ayahuasca puke so much, right?
No, I respect plant medicine and practitioners and people who do it, but I have no desire. I'm like,
me neither. I'm way too scared.
Scares me. Yeah.
So
going back a little bit on being stuck, what are your thoughts on self-sabotage? Is there such a thing as that?
I love how you teed that up. Thank you so much. There's no such thing as self-sabotage. It's the wrong, just like mental health is not mental, it's physiological. So the words that and this isn't me just being a word nerd, the words we use to describe what's happening to us matter. Because how are we going to change it if we're talking about the wrong thing? There's no such thing as self-sabotage. Now, people get so pissed off at me when I say that. I'm like, I smoked meth. I understand that we all make choices that can do bad things, but self-sabotage isn't really the thing. It's a very suboptimal way to protect ourselves from either an unpleasant truth or a dangerous environment, or in some way insulate ourselves from something that our body feels intolerable. But even the most self-sabotaging behaviors, again, up close, have the intention of self-protection. It doesn't excuse them, but it does explain them. If you're trying to self-protect, that's going to require a whole different ball of something than if you're trying to self-sabotage. Now I just feel shame because, oh my God, why am I doing this to myself? Well, you're doing it because part of you feels like you're in danger if you don't. Well, that makes sense. So now I can get momentum instead of spinning in the I suck stories.
Yeah. What do you think about though, like people who are hurtful, like we were talking a little bit earlier, you say that person's crazy and you said they're very aware, like they're very aware of what they're doing, but are they aware of what the pain that they're causing to the other person and that's okay with them? Like, how does that work?
That falls on a spectrum. So, someone who is struggling with an addiction is going to cause a lot of hurt. I don't think that person is doing it intentionally, but like, so it's a spectrum from like full sociopathy to I'm just trying to deal with my stuff and people get hurt along the way. But again, I was in a very abusive environment with all of the different forms of abuse, assault that there is. And this was a hard one for me. I'm like, no, they don't know what they're doing. And but they do. And I've worked with enough people that even if they didn't mean it, even if that wasn't their intention, generally speaking, abusive people know when they're being abusive and they do understand the devastation. And that was a harder pill to swallow for me than the abuse itself. Cause like, I'm like, okay, fine. I can take a black eye because I was being a bitch and I provoked and blah, blah, blah. But he didn't know and he didn't mean it. And he loves me and he wouldn't do this because his pain, because when he was a kid, this and this and that happened. And I could identify the origin story of the abuse, but that doesn't excuse it. And that doesn't mean that there's an unconscious, I have no idea what I am doing. People who harm other people generally are aware of it.
Right. Yeah. I feel the same way.
Yeah, I know.
I
Like,
know.
I know.
We
It's a
could
bummer.
talk for hours about that, couldn't we?
And like selfishly, you know, if they're not on drugs and they're harming you or whatever, you know, they're just selfish and they want what they want for their own gain and they're hurting people along the way. I mean, where does that come from? Like, why are some people wired that way and some people aren't?
And the crazy explanation makes us feel better because if they're
Right.
crazy, it doesn't justify it, but it's like, well, surely people would never do something that terrible to someone else. And I love that we've now gone to the dark side of the psyche because I love going to the dark side of the psyche. But there are people who, for whatever reason, it could be a combination of genetics and the environment and secondary trauma and whatever, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of people with trauma who don't do these things.
Right.
But whatever the origin of it, people do really bad things. And it's really hard to say that they're just crazy. It's like, well, now you're getting into the what is evil and what's the nature of reality and consciousness, which is way above my pay grade. But people do really bad things and they are well aware that they are doing the bad things. And that's scarier than saying, wow, they're just crazy.
Right. Yeah, I think it's easier to say they're crazy, isn't it?
So like with narcissism, like high level, like high, not just you're being a narcissist, not like you posted a selfie. I'm talking like high level, like sociopathic, narcissistic personality stuff. I can explain it. And I've worked with enough narcissists in therapy that understanding the origin of the behavior is not difficult, but it doesn't excuse it. It's not like, oh, poor you, Pat, this happened. And therefore now you're like wreaking havoc on every single person's life who you date. Right. But hard to understand the why. The harder thing is now that I am in it, what do I do about it? And if it was easy to leave it, we all would do it. It's not.
Yeah. And a lot of empathetic people draw in narcissistic personalities, don't you think?
Yes, I identify as I'm just an empath. I can feel pain. I can heal them. They just let me love them and all will be well. That's the dark side of empathy is thinking people. It's like, nope. Sure can't.
Oh, you take it from me. I'm telling you right now, everyone, PSA, you cannot.
Oh, Beck, I love you. What are your thoughts on procrastination?
Okay, so from the dark side of psyche and evil and narcissistic personality disorder to why are you binge watching Bridgerton again or scrolling on TikTok? Procrastination, I hate that word so much because it's such a like, what is that word? We're not doing the thing we want to do, that there's no logical reason that we can't do. So cool, great. Procrastination is a freeze response. It's our brain shutting down in response to whatever. And again, it doesn't excuse it. But if we know that there's parasympathetic procrastination where your nervous system is stuck on off, or sympathetic procrastination where our nervous system gets stuck on, that gives you more information, because again, you can't solve a sympathetic overactive nervous system problem with a parasympathetic thing. So we really want to talk about what we're talking about. Procrastination is a nervous system that's freaked out for some reason.
Okay. That's a good way to view it.
Maybe it's not a bad thing all the time.
You know, I was just talking to someone who was beating themselves up because they really needed to be doing X, Y, and Z. And what's wrong with them that they're procrastinating? I'm like, dude, you just worked a 17-hour day. You have 3 children. Your wife is ill. You live with your aging parents. And there's a global pandemic plus geopolitical insanity and everything else. Like your procrastination makes sense because your body cannot sustain the pace that you are requiring it to do. So again, it's not always ideal, but sometimes procrastination is our body's cry for relief and rest, which is not popular in our go do the thing culture.
I agree. I mean, sometimes don't you just go, I just wish I had a day to binge watch a show. But then you have that day and you're like, I'm bored.
That's Beck.
I'm bored.
Totally. I'm like, no, I have 7 things I need to do. I'm going to do that.
Yes, because we're so fried that even our rest day becomes a boredom day because we become addicted to our own cortisol, which is also bananas.
Oh,
that
true. Yeah, that is true. What about, okay, so I've heard you say you don't like the words lazy or unmotivated. They're false. Explain that.
And again, I was born and raised in New York. So especially people from the East Coast are always like, how can you say there's no such thing as a lazy person? Look at that person. Clearly they're lazy. And someone said that about, I was like someone's 19-year-old kid was laying on the couch smoking weed all day and playing video games. And I'm like, is he lazy or are the parents enabling the behavior? So there's his bills are paid. There's food in the fridge. Exactly. The lights are on. Is he lazy or is he taking advantage of a situation where everything is being enabled? That's not it's still problematic, but lazy is not the right word. Sometimes we're quote lazy because we're being enabled. Sometimes we're quote lazy because we're actually depressed and our nervous system is stuck in the off button. Sometimes we're quote lazy because we're burned out and we actually need rest. But there's no such thing as a lazy person. There's a function to the behavior. So let's call it what it is.
I think that's so true. Like in this generation too, where parents are sticking iPads in front of their kids just so they don't have to deal with them. That's creating a behavior for someone, right? And then that will carry into their life and create that lazy, quote unquote, lazy behavior. That's a really good way to look at it.
You can say from a neuroscience perspective, that lazy kid is actually engaging in a very effective energy conservation strategy, because why would we do something if we didn't have to? Most of us don't make healthy changes unless we are forced to by either a relationship falling apart or a physical illness or some sort of catastrophic life consequence. But to a kiddo whose every need is being tended to, that's not laziness. That's just being enabled. That's being efficient, energetically speaking.
Do you think when someone's at that point that what can be done? I mean, what do you do?
In the case of the enabling thing?
Yeah, like let's say you're 15-year-olds doing, looking to appearing to be lazy, but because you've never truly parented them, spent a lot of quality time with them, their friend is the TV, whatever. How do you fix that?
Well, first, I don't have children, so I would never shame by choice. I would never shame parents because parenting is incredibly difficult. And that's one of the reasons I've chosen not to do it. So no shame, no shade to parents. And the best thing a parent in that situation can do is get support for themselves. Like there's a reason. If a mom is a single mom working 4 jobs to take care of this kid and is too busy trying to make ends meet and keep them safe from a narcissistic, abusive ex, I'm not going to be like, Mom, you're enabling your kid and it's your fault.
But I mean, as the kid, like as the teenager, how do we, is there a type of therapy or something that can be done with that person to break them from what they've known to, maybe exploring a new way to live, new way to spend their time?
So if we're going that route, I would tell a parent that I work with, well, who's paying for the Wi-Fi? Change the Wi-Fi password and don't turn it back on until whatever needs to get done is done. And it's like, that's easier said than done. To break a habit is going to require a detox and a very angry, upset teenager problem. But if we're just talking behavior modification, who pays for the cell phone and the iPad and the computer and the tablet and all of the things? If that's you, then you have choices, then you can do it. But rather than strict behavior modification, I like, if we have the opportunity to do the relational work of, what's going on in the system that everyone feels so unsupported, that this has become the norm. And in a perfect world, how can we help and support and adjust it instead of just punishing the teenager by suddenly removing their access?
Right. Because I feel like that isn't, if they were trained basically to live like that.
Yeah, they don't know any different.
Not as simple as like take it away and that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's say someone comes to me as a patient and I can see they have a strong history of trauma. needs to be dealt with before I can do what I do with my testing and diet change and maybe supplement protocol. And I send them to someone like you. What do you think are like the core things that people can start to work on? Or, you know, how does this work? You know, how does working on trauma begin? Like, how do we do this?
It's really tough, right? Because sometimes it's come see the therapist before any of the medical things can work. But
Right.
sometimes it's I send people to you because I
Yeah.
can't do anything when your diet is 3 pots of coffee and 4
Yeah.
packs of cigarettes a day. And I can't do anything with you until if you're malnourished and if you're sleep deprived and if your, you know, your physiological biological functions are completely off kilter. So it's really hard to know like which thing comes first. And then I just go like, let's assess what's the low hanging fruit, what is available, and what are they willing to start doing. It's a lot easier for me to do trauma therapy on someone who's eaten food and had sleep than
Right. Well, we tend to see people who are doing well with that as far as they understand what foods they need to eat. They understand how important sleep is, but they are in sympathetic overdrive. Like they cannot get out of it. Their body is so sensitive. They can't handle smells. They can't handle foods. They can't handle supplements. And we know they need to work on like the limbic system and work on past traumas and that type of thing before they're going to be able to tolerate anything that we can do, because they're probably down to 4 foods that they can eat. So, you know, do you feel like, you know, there's a place that people can start? Like I guess what I'm asking is, as a listener, being, you know, okay, I'm so sensitive, I can't handle this, but I know I have some past trauma. Like, where do they start? Like if they already know what to do with us and they're doing the best that they can, where do they start with, you know, therapy?
And I treat this like any addiction, and this is not a shamey thing. It's just sympathetic overactivation is a sign that there's some things that we're avoiding, which is that is the definition of addiction. Is I'm doing a thing despite it's causing me negative consequences, nevertheless I keep doing it. And again, no shame, but if someone comes to me who's been living in that zone, we have to start by acknowledging this sounds counterintuitive, but if this is you and you're listening, let's start with, has it gotten bad enough that dealing with your feelings is actually a better, easier prospect than what's happening now? Because we tend to not shift out of whatever it is we're doing until the pain of doing it is greater than the pain of not doing it. So my first question is, have you had enough pain? Because this process is going to suck. It's really hard and unpleasant. And making the decision to heal your trauma doesn't immediately produce a good feeling. Just like making like when I started eating food after being anorexic and smoking cigarettes and drinking Diet Mountain Dew or whatever, eating vegetables felt like I was dying. Like it felt like my body was being ripped in half, because eating healthy doesn't feel good if you've not eaten food for a while. And so let's uncouple this idea that making good decisions is going to immediately give you a dopamine hit of pleasure and awesomeness. That way it's not a surprise when you hit the wall, which you will, and we can work through that. But making a plan for here's what it's going to look like in the first few weeks of detoxing off of being on go is going to feel like coming off of a drug. And you're going to crash and you're going to be depressed and bored and unhappy and question yourself and everything else. And again, we all go through that because it's brain. But if we can plan for that, then we won't quit when that happens, which it will inevitably.
Yeah. Do you find clients too, like, get addicted with the why, wanting to know where does this come from? Where did I have trauma? Like, how do you deal with that? You know what I mean?
I was obsessed with the why. I mean, I made a career out of it. I didn't become a therapist because I loved and wanted to help people. I mean, that's great now, but I became a therapist because I'm like, I'll be damned if I'm not going to understand why I am the way I am and why things are. But all of the insight in the world doesn't change things. And so the why matters. What happens to us, our stories matter. But when you're spinning, you don't start with why. Why is like a mile 7 thing, not a mile marker 1 thing. So instead of why am I like this, it's like, well, I can answer that, but we're still going to be sitting here stuck in the mud. So instead of starting with why, I like to start with what are 5 choices available to you right now, today. Of those, pick one, do it, repeat, and eventually we can figure out why later.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because sometimes you can't really figure out the why, and it's not really the most important part.
Yeah, I know.
Thank
That's what
God. You know, if we
Yeah.
had to know why every single thing, like, I don't know why certain sounds trip me out. I don't know why
Yeah.
I'm really hypersensitive to things. I don't know why, but it doesn't matter. You know, our stories matter, and understanding the origin of things can be helpful. But if you don't know why something is happening, that doesn't mean it's not going to be able to be healed or shift or change or transform or whatever.
Don't you think it's also important not to compare your trauma to anyone else's? Like, Crystal and I did a course, and we learned that. And it was like, wow. Because you think, well, I wasn't beaten,
wasn't
or
that
whatever.
bad.
You know what I mean? It wasn't, I can't have trauma because I didn't have this happen. But that, to me now, knowing, I'm like, wow, that's so untrue.
Well,
But
that's a rabbit hole that goes on for, I mean, I went through, when I was in a relationship where I was black and blue, I actually said to myself, well, yeah, like, he hits me and I'm bruised, but it's not like I'm in the hospital. It's not like
right.
I'm unconscious. You know, it's like, yeah, he did this and this and that, but it's not like I'm near death. And so comparison is a binary. It's they have it worse, therefore I don't get to have my pain. Perspective is useful. Like, all things considered, how fortunate am I to have resources? How fortunate am I to have a safe place to live? But comparison is, you have it worse, therefore I don't have a right to my pain, which it's pointless, and it's really silly. It's like, would you not go to the hospital if you broke your leg because somewhere in the world someone has 2 broken legs? It's like, someone is always worse off. So by that logic, only one person on the planet gets to get help.
Yeah, it's so true. And people downplay, a lot of people, like, especially in relationships, right? They downplay everything. Yeah.
Like, well, yeah, they cheated, but it's not like blah, blah, blah. It's like the comparison thing sometimes is a shame thing because we don't feel the right to our pain. But sometimes the comparison is an avoidance thing. For me, it was because I wasn't ready to contend with, no, this person is well aware of what's happening. It's not changing. It's not going to, I can't empathy, magic-y love them through it. And I didn't want to deal with that until I was ready. So
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend, sorry, Crystal, who's kind of in that, it's like a not ready to leave type of situation. So everything is downplayed, and it's stuff that when I hear, I think it's horrific, but it's all downplayed, and it's my fault too. I'm just as much at fault as they are. And I'm just like, I remember being there. I've been there, and it's just like, it's crazy.
It's hard to witness.
And
I was there too. I feel for my girlfriends who I would call and say this stuff to, and kudos to them for just holding compassionate space and not shaking and like trying. But like, I wouldn't have listened to it back then. I just needed someone to be willing to not enable me, but if I was going to call someone, that they would love me, even though I was making no sense at all at the time.
Yeah. And that's hard to do. It's what you want from someone else, but it's hard to do when you really love someone. You want to like jump in and rescue them, and you can't, and you have to just sit there and let them tell you their frustrations and give like little bits and pieces of what you're really thinking. But it's hard, but it's true, because no one is going to change what they're doing based on what you say.
If only, right? And that's
right. We all got to go through our journeys.
Like, you could give someone the most perfect protocol in the world, and I could outline the best treatment goals, somatically speaking, but it has to be self-directed is not it's your fault. It's just people assuming they have choices. Some people have no choices, but assuming they have choices has to be on their terms when they make the choices.
Yeah. So with trauma, and I know, I mean, we are so hard on ourselves too, right? So how can we forgive and be grateful for a lot of the experiences that we do have?
Forgive yourself, forgive the abuser. Who are we talking about forgiving?
Well, being grateful for the difficult things we've experienced, like learning lessons and things like that.
I don't know if we have, I mean, there's a lot. And again, if whatever spiritual tradition someone belongs to, I respect it. I'll speak for myself. I don't think forgiveness and gratitude for our trauma is necessary. And it's not always helpful. Like the 12 steps say, and I believe this, that eventually we won't regret the past and we won't shut the door on it. And I would not want to repeat 1 second of my life.
Right.
But I wouldn't change it. That doesn't mean I'm grateful for it. It means I love where I'm at today. Therefore, I accept that this is my path. But I don't feel grateful for my childhood sexual abuse. I don't feel like I forgive the person or people who sexually assaulted me as a result of my choices from the childhood stuff. I don't sit in anger about it, but it's sort of like, it's not a forgiveness thing. It's not a gratitude thing. It's an acceptance thing. It's like, okay, well, that happens. Cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if it's smaller, like if you're in a bad relationship and you learn not to take that type of behavior from someone else, that could be something you're grateful for having experienced, even though it hurt. But like you were saying, if it's like sexual trauma, I don't know where you're grateful for that, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
okay.
Like,
so you talk about how we feel isn't as important as action steps we take to change that. Can you elaborate on that?
So another place I see a lot of people get stuck is like this making a good decision. I should feel good about taking the walk. I should feel good about calling my friend. I should feel good. It's like, you don't have to feel good for the change to still take place. You know, I may not feel like taking my dog out for a walk, but if I do it, that's going to yield benefits later on that I might not necessarily feel in the moment. So I'm a big, don't wait till you feel like it. Just start doing the things. And sometimes your feelings will catch up and sometimes they won't. Sometimes I like working out now, but sometimes I don't. And you know, like I'm going to the gym as soon as we're done here. And I really would rather lay on my couch and eat pizza and not do it today. I don't feel like it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And that doesn't in any way take away from the benefit of it. But a lot of people will say, well, it's not authentic because I don't really feel it. It's like, doesn't matter. You know, fake it till you make it. Act as if, and your feelings will sometimes catch up and it's okay if they don't.
And you usually will feel better after.
I'll be glad.
I do.
Yes, I'll be glad after the fact.
Yeah, for sure.
So for listeners that are, you know, listening here and they just want to know if they're feeling stuck or if they've dealt with a lot of trauma, you know, what is the best advice you could give them?
So the first piece of advice is remind yourself often that you're not crazy. Like you may not have one other insight into anything that's going on in your life, but if you can remind yourself daily, you're not crazy. This makes sense. That's going to do a lot of good. Like that is the most potent medicine I can offer is you're not crazy. You make sense. And then the second one is don't start with why. Start with what are my choices? Those two things are really powerful and they're not hard to do and they're free.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you?
Yeah, this was fun. We went to all of the places. You can find me on Instagram where I struggle with my boundaries and I'm there often. So it's just at Britt Frank. My book, The Science of Stuck, you can buy wherever you buy books and come say hello to me in the internet place. I love meeting people.
Oh, we love that. Well, thank you so much. You're wonderful. We just loved this. It was great.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. And if you love this episode, please leave a review. It only takes a couple minutes. And you can find out more about us on drbeckycampbell.com. And you can follow us over at Instagram on @HealthBabesPodcast, @Dr. Becky Campbell, and @Dr. Crystal Hone. Have an amazing day.